Yeah, this is wildlife biologist Eric Orff with the New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife. This is Monday, July 7th or 8th, right in there. So I've been thinking lately about the animals that I've handled, tagged, or marked during my career as a wildlife biologist, as a New Hampshire Fish and Game wildlife biologist, and some of the other things I've done. Well, I was thinking the other day, I have actually tagged from mussels to moose. Now, let me tell you a little bit about these. Right here, the Suncook River flows behind my house, maybe 60, 70 yards away, and there was a great Mother's Day flood, I think 2005 or 2006. And here in town, during the 100-year flood, a mile of the Suncook River went dry due to an avulsion. The river actually changed course. Well, a few days later, it was discovered that there was a whole population of brook floater mussels. Brook floater mussels are a federally threatened species, and there were some known in New Hampshire here and there, but no big populations. And when the riverbed below the dam actually started going dry, it was discovered a huge population of brook floater mussels. So the staff from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here in New Hampshire, as well as the New Hampshire Fish and Game staff, and some volunteers gathered up probably more than 100 brook floater mussels. And luckily, the staff down at the federal fish hatchery, the Fish and Wildlife Fish Hatchery in Nashua, figured out how to raise them and keep them alive. Well, some time later, it was decided to put them back in the Suncook River up in Chichester. And I worked with a Professor Barry Wicklow from St. Anselm College, who I'd known for some years, who was going to determine how successful this transplant was. So I spent a couple days on the Suncook River tagging the mussels that were captured and saved from when the riverbed was going dry, plus there were some other ones there. So yes, I actually tagged brook floater mussels. I also, before I even worked at Fish and Game beginning in 1976, in the mid-70s, I had a permit to ban songbirds. Bill Ingham, who was a wildlife biologist at Fish and Game, had a permit to, which are difficult to get, to ban songbirds, and I was a sub-permittee under him. So I got a mist net. It's a very fine mist net, black, and you string it up and the birds can't see it and they fly in. So I had that, and I began in the wintertime around 1974, 75 in there to ban birds. And back then there was quite a population of evening grosbeaks in and about, and I would ban in the wintertime evening grosbeaks, blue jays, chickadees, nuthatches, and whatnot at my parents' home in Londonderry, because they'd had a bird feeder for many years. And then that next spring, I actually used my mist net to catch American woodcock and put leg bands on them as well. So I began banding woodcock and songbirds in the mid-70s. But, you know, my whole life I caught animals. You know, we lived briefly in Oklahoma in the 1950s, and when I was 4 years old, I would catch horned toads in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I was forever catching things. Turtles and frogs and snakes and even chipmunks and squirrels. Whatever I could catch, I would catch. So my job as a wildlife biologist fit right in perfectly with the things that I'd love to do my whole life. Well, at Fish and Game, I became the black bear biologist in October of '78. 2 days into that, I helped capture and tag my first bear in October of 1978, and I began to tag them for a period of years. In 1983, I worked with my supervisor, Henry Laramie. We captured a couple dozen deer or more on Long Island, Wintersaki, tagged all of those. 1986 and 87, we actually, Fish and Game, using a graduate student from the University of New Hampshire, we began to do a moose study. So we caught 20 moose in the summer, fall of 1986, and again 20 more in '87. Put radio collars on them, plus of course tagged them all. So I tagged, plus I'd already tagged some moose that were, got into trouble in Concord or Portsmouth and had to be moved out of town because they were in danger of injuring themselves or someone else. So I tagged those. I tagged turkeys with turkey biologist Ted Walski. In the mid to late 80s, we began to ban more waterfowl with waterfowl biologist Ed Robinson, who would actually capture several hundred ducks, mostly mallards and black ducks and a few wood ducks, and banded those, lake banded those. In around 1989, we began a study of what's called resident geese. They had moved into southern New Hampshire, the geese that don't migrate very far. In the first couple of years, we actually put big white neck bands on them with unique letters and numbers so we could monitor their movements here in New Hampshire. Plus, of course, we leg band them all. In fact, geese are still leg banded today. In fact, in order to have a waterfowl season, a duck hunting and goose hunting season, the state is kind of required by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to continue to ban ducks and geese. In fact, I think just last week, the waterfowl biologist now probably ended up catching another 600 or 800 Canada geese here in New Hampshire. So I caught turkeys and geese and ducks. Out at the Alza Shoals, we caught some terns, common terns, and banded those. And it's not just birds and geese and bears and moose and deer that I've tagged, but also fish. Now, when I started out my career at Fishing Game as a fisheries bioaid and biologist, and we used to actually mark lake trout that were in the hatcheries to determine whether the Fishing Game Department should continue to raise lake trout for stocking compared to those that were naturally born in the lakes themselves. And it was determined by the mid-80s that Fishing Game no longer needed to actually raise lake trout. Back in the late 70s, there was a coho salmon program in New Hampshire. I marked many hundreds, if not thousands, of coho salmon, landlocked salmon. So from mussels to moose and throw in some fish. Oh, bass. I worked the summer of 1978 on Wentworth Lake in Wolfboro, where I was tagging bass. I tagged over 100 smallmouth bass. I put a Monel tag right in their lip. So yes, I've tagged and marked fish and moose and deer and bear and turkeys. So I've had a whole career of catching animals and tagging and marking wildlife here in New Hampshire.